Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Hessian Scrum. Joining me today is Katie from Thaumaturgy. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, happy to be here, man. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So let's start off with the latest released, Pestilential Hymns, that just came out a few months ago. Quite a bit of a step up. I've heard of I've heard your first two releases, Charnel Gnosis and Tenebrous Oblations, but this is a completely different beast. Can you tell us how this came along?
Um, yeah, so you're right that it was a big change. And it was very intentionally that way. And it was just because I felt as if, the first two obviously leaned a little bit more in that Death Doom, kind of the newer version of that too that came out late 20 teens and early 2020s. Um, and so I did that for a couple releases because I was pretty inspired by some albums that came out around that time to do something similar. And so I kept the scope really small and I kept it, really reined in. Tried to keep it very simple music, you know, caveman type music, as some would say. But after about two releases of that, I felt like I had kind of explored the extent to which I could write that. Obviously, there's all sorts of different ways to do it than how I did. Mine was a little more death metal oriented. Even if even when I tried not to be that way, it just came out that way. Um, but it was about the extent that I could pull that off anymore. And so I kind of thought, and also I should add that my range of influences, there was a lot more to it than there was in that sort of death doom, orthodox kind of black metal background. And I was purposely not including those to try and keep that scope smaller. But it got to where I just, I wasn't having fun if I wasn't including a little bit of Emperor or if I wasn't including a little bit of, my influences from Sinister or something like that. So I really wanted to, with the newest album, I had a number of goals. I wanted to, on the more dry technical sense, I wanted to include a lot more variation in the types of riffs that I did, not just either tremolo picking or just like heavy, slowed down power chord sections. I wanted to include a lot more melody, a lot of variation in guitar playing style. And then I also really wanted to include some of those like darker black metal melodies, the more romantic gothic style that you might hear in early Swedish death metal or something like that. Um, and I wanted to do that in a way that was also a little bit more concise. Maybe the songs weren't quite as long; they're still pretty long, but nothing that drags on and kind of forces the listener to get through the slog a little bit. I wanted to make it pop out a little bit more.
Yeah, and also the funny things that like pretty much all the kind of aesthetic identifiers of the first two releases are gone. It's not like super reverb heavy guitars, new vocalist, right, and everything, and bigger production, more professional sounding. I mean, what inspired you to go down that path?
What's funny about that is some of that was technical limitations. Because the prior two albums, I actually mic'd a guitar amp, um, and you can't hear my dog in the background, can you?
Yeah, I can hear him a bit. Don't worry.
Okay, cool. But yeah, so I mic'd amps for the first two, but so since I released the first two albums, had kids and they're tiny little kids, and I only record at night and they're sleeping, so I couldn't do that anymore, and so I had to switch over to an amp sim, like plug directly in amp sim, which ended up giving it that drier sound, which funny enough kind of fit the new direction I was going in, because had I given it that really big reverb heavy live amp sound, some of the intricacies might have been lost in the guitar playing. So there was that, and then really just me, to some extent, me just getting better at the mixing and mastering in general to try and bring out, highlight this or that, and create a little bit more space for every instrument, because I'm I am by no means an expert at, mixing, mastering, recording, any of that. I'm just kind of fumbling my way through it. So by the time I got to the third album, I had a little bit more experience in that regard. And it worked for the aesthetic of each one, where, the first one definitely very rough, very, very reverb heavy. But it's also kind of the sound I was going for at the time. And then as the riffs tightened up per album, then I got a little bit better at being able to accent that.
Definitely. And also, why the change in vocalists? I mean, you added two vocalists technically, and you're still doing the backing vocals as well.
Um, that one, so after I finished Tenebris Oblations, I started working on material for, I was thinking it was just going to be, I was going to do a little EP that would highlight the changes, kind of the direction I was going, because the direction I wanted to go was, it was immediate. It was right after I finished Tenebris Oblations, before it was even released. I was already, planning the stylistic switch. And so then I had started writing. It was actually Entropic Hegemony. That was the very first one I wrote for this album. And as I wrote it, I wrote some lyrics. I started doing some vocals, and it was just not the fit. I don't know if it's the tempo. I don't know if it's just the overall stylistic change, but it was just not working. I could tell. I felt as if my vocals, I mean, they're great. They're they're cool, low, cavernous, and all that, but they just didn't have the power and frenetic aspect to them that I felt like that the music needed. So I hit up my friend Tyler. He goes by TG on the album, because he had done vocals for me in some past works, and I just had a sense that it would work much better for this. So we tried it out on Entropic Hegemony and released it as a digital single, and I thought it just worked excellent. It fit the style so much better. And then by the time I included him, his style of vocals kind of forced me to approach writing a little bit differently, because, well, both his style of vocals and his lyrics that he writes have a little bit more of a sense of tragedy to them, tortured sounding and all that. So then I had to change the songwriting style to where it would maybe reflect that, to where you have a little bit more of that tragedy and aspect to it, rather than before. It was kind of it was that meditative, maybe even a little bit horror tinged. And then with his vocals, I felt like I had to switch it a little bit.
Because, I mean, that's quite an interesting choice vocally. I've seen a lot of people were commenting about it, right? Like, going for that kind of Martin Van Drunen almost ranting approach, which is pretty much dead
Yeah,
from death metal nowadays.
yeah. And I knew immediately once we used it that, because he almost can't help it. That's just what he does. I even had to, after we recorded about half of Pestilential Hymns. It was a little bit too tortured and absolutely batshit crazy, and I felt like it would take away from the album. So we had to go back and have him tone it back a little bit. But it's just kind of what he naturally does, which is crazy to me, because, as you know, my vocals are not that way at all. Um, but you're right in that I don't hear really anybody doing that at all, or even, for the most part, even interested in it. So I knew that it would be divisive. I knew that it would, some people would just have absolutely no interest in the album because of that, but it fit so well. I felt like we had to do it.
Yeah. Also on this one, you do play a lot more with synths, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the songs have like long outros or long intros. Um, was it an ignominious end as well? It was pretty much just like a, kind of like palate cleanser.
Mm-hmm.
So, where did that idea come for, expansive synths?
Why did we include them?
Yeah.
Sorry, kind of cut out there.
Oh, no worries.
Um, so it just kind of felt in this situation as if the synths, they almost, every time they're used in this album, add this kind of like a sorrowful atmosphere to it. And I didn't even always do that intentionally, but the moment that I would start using them to try to add a little bit more power to a section, or maybe make it sound, have a little bit more mystery, sound mystical. It ended up sounding like, this that much more sorrowful and tortured. And so then after I included it on a couple of the early songs, then I started always, using it to go in that direction. And so the outros usually, they're supposed to give that sense of trying to think of a good way to put it, a non-triumphant end to the song, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see exactly what you mean. The tragedy is complete, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. But then again, also was there like a technical change like in terms of playing because there's a lot of really intricate playing going on, a lot of kind of like very weird harmonies I want to dive into later, but there's it's a lot busier than your previous stuff, and I feel like maybe there was something that allowed you to get to that level.
Um, so what happened there was, so I'm not the best guitar player around, but I've been playing for a really long time. I'm 35 years old now, and I've been playing since I was like 10. So I'm decently technically proficient. And the first two albums were very, very intentionally throttled. I very purposely didn't include that because, right or wrong, I kind of have this feeling that, we went through the early 2000s of tech death and deathcore, and that's what I grew up around that time and absolutely despised that stuff. And so I have this internal sense that I have to pull it back and not include too much technical playing because it'll draw away from the intention of the song. And that if a song cannot be, if you can't get your point across with simple riffs, then don't do it at all. So that was kind of the intention for the first two albums. But then, as again, it kind of got to where there were certain influences I had, be it Emperor or Sacramentum or At the Gates or something like that, mixed with the fact that I could do a little bit more proficient guitar playing. And at a certain point, I was just tired of holding it back, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So I wanted to include it to make the songs a little bit more interesting and varied throughout. So it wasn't just kind of a monotonous experience.
exactly. So the funny thing, so Tyler from Necropolis did most of the vocals on Pestilential Hymn, but there was a third guy, right, who is doing
Mhm.
some sparse vocals in the backgrounds at various points.
Yep. Yeah. So that's David. I think we called him DS on the album, and he so it kind of seemed odd to include him for, he did, I don't know, like an interlude section here and there. But excuse me, he was initially included to do some additional guitar work because he's a pretty good guitar player, and I mean, he makes some pretty excellent riffs. And but he was a little bit too busy during the time of the writing period, and we had somewhat of a deadline with Memento Mori, that we had agreed to, and I got to where I ended up having to do all of the writing just because of everybody's schedules. Unfortunately, at this point, we're all adults and busy. So I ended up writing everything. And by the end of it, he submitted some riffs, and they were just not quite what we were looking for. It may have sounded a little bit more like Belial, the Finnish band, if you know them.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
yeah, it sounded a lot like that. So I encouraged him to just use those and go on to put out his own stuff, which I think he's in the process of doing. But then since we had already agreed to have him on, I'm like, well, shoot, man, you've got some good vocals. Why don't you come in and do a couple of the interlude sections? And it was a little bit of an homage to, the three of us have been in bands before, so it was my chance to bring them all back in for my one man project.
So I wanted to go through like some like a concrete example. So I think Neuroticism Triumphant is really interesting. So first you start off with kind of immolation-esque death metal, then you get this kind of weird, small breakdown, and then for no reason it just goes into full-on demigod slumber of sullen eyes. Like the right part playing white, like this kind of similar melody to them, melodic but still kind of very exotic in a way, right? And then the left one is chugging like they would do because obviously they were very inspired by Bolt Thrower. And then you shift that to where if I remember correctly, the right side, the right guitar is still playing that same melody, but then you have like kind of Emperor-esque like arpeggiated passage. Stuff like that. Like, how'd you come up with that?
Um, Trying to think specifically for that song as I wrote it. I have it's kind of a mixture of two things. Like as I write, there's a certain, I'm sure you've heard this before. I'm sure you do some music writing of your own, that where there's just something that you hear it come next after the riff. So maybe I've made that first section where there's the interplay of a couple riffs, and then that sort of arpeggiated emperor style, maybe even a little bit of sacramentum. Uh, it was just playing in my head, and I thought, okay, well, you know what? In on my past two albums, I would have purposely not included that. I would have thought, oh, okay, well, that's going to draw too much away from the overall aesthetic and maybe switch it up too much. So I'm not going to do that. But here, I just kind of had this who gives a shit approach. We're just going to put in everything that's cool, and so it sounded awesome. It created sort of this crescendo of the song. Yeah, it brings it to this big climax. And so I thought, why not include it? And I won't deny my Emperor influence for a second. It's one of my favorite bands of all time, at least their first album. And so uh, I kind of saw that as soon as I wrote the riff. I thought, well, of course, now I'm going to have to put in the sort of choir and strings background as well. I don't have a choice.
Yeah, 'Cause- because I think the album for me, its greatest strength is that we've seen the kind of whole OSDM revival stuff, right? Where it's very easy to go, I'll take a bit of Obituary, a bit of Morbid Angel, Deicide, whatever you want, and mix it together. It just ends up sounding like Spotify fodder, death metal that you put in the background, right? But how do you manage to kind of like take all these very different influences that you have and to actually make songs that sound like good and not just like a hodgepodge of random things?
Well, I'm glad you think so, because I worried about that with this one a little bit. Is that since I was bringing in the whole of the influences, that it may end up sounding a little bit chopped up like that. But and I wish I could give you a better answer on how, other than uh, it's I just try to let the song organically build itself from section to section. So I'll write. Usually, you can see on this album how a lot of times the first half, or at least first third of the song, will be an interplay between about three riffs. You could almost call it like a verse chorus structure, but not quite. Um, and then after that, I will very consciously purposely change the direction that the song is going to create a little bit of a break. But I try to allow it to develop in an organic way, something that sounds natural next, but draws your attention away from the beginning. Um, and as for how to blend it all together well to where it's not sounding like a hodgepodge, that one, I don't, I'm not entirely sure how I did it. I wish I could give you a better answer. It just kind of happened naturally, um, after doing the first two albums the way I did. As soon as I brought in the other influences, it just kind of rolled out the way that it did.
Right. Because that is like I always feel like that's the biggest problem with with death metal now. It's just if you have a little bit of technical proficiency, it becomes a very simple genre to replicate, and not very well though. But
Yeah, that's for sure. That That's my biggest problem. Where there was a time there for a bit where it seemed like there was this explosion of bands in that old school style, which for me, I started noticing it around 2019 to about 2022, and it was catching my attention. And so I'd listen to a lot of them and think, oh, these guys are great. Uh, and by now, 2026, it they're a dime a dozen. I don't even find myself really going back to a lot of those newer bands that I thought sounded pretty cool and in the style of music that I like, um, because whatever it is, they just don't have that distinctive sound, that creativity. of the late 80s, early 90s. They don't have it. They're just kind of doing, it's like a simulacrum. They're just doing this imitation of it. Which maybe, somebody could say, oh, well, that's just your nostalgia for whatever old music you like. But for whatever reason, it all just sounds the same to me. And so I did certainly have the goal of not putting out something like that was just, slop to go in the pile of 500 new bands every year. Whether or not that succeeded is up to the listeners. I'm glad that you think it did. Because yeah, like you're saying, everything that comes out nowadays is just generally uninteresting, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. I feel, but uh, speaking about pestilential hymns, I think my own there's this weird effect where I felt like, the first time I listened to it, I felt like I was missing a lot of details. That sometimes it feels a bit on initial listens, it feels a bit kind of not samey, but a bit flat sometimes. But then when you really focus on it, that's when you really notice that there's a lot going on, and it's really weird because normally with most albums I come across, you tend to have like a good idea of what's going on first or second listen. But this one, it seems as it's one of those albums where if you don't really focus, it won't give you much.
That's interesting. And I think it was Shelley from over at Hate Meditation said something similar. Was that it was multiple listens that would make the intricacies of this album come out. And I don't know if that's because my two theories would be one, just general recording quality. Maybe it's just too muddy here and there, but I don't. Also, I would wonder too is if some of the complaints I had on the earlier albums was the over or the use or consistent use of tremolo pick uh, over blast beats over long periods of time would kind of make things blend together. And I think I use that a lot still. I didn't entirely do away with that on this newest album. So I wonder if sometimes it can kind of become like a homogenous experience. Uh, and it can blow by you as it's going, and you may have to go back like you said a couple times and then pick out these different sections here and there and really feel how the mood of the song can change, but the surface level sounds very similar if you're not paying a lot of attention. And so I wonder if it's a combination of the either the recording or that use of tremolo pick, which I can't seem to get away from. Like I said, I wanted to I wanted to vary it up a little bit on this new album, but for whatever reason, I use that style a lot.
Because, speaking of tremolo picking as well, your previous releases were very, well, it felt like to me, inspired by Profanatica, Hedge. I know Tyler loves those bands. And here, there doesn't seem to be kind of any USBM influence at all.
Yeah, that was a very overt goal early on. Was Profanatica and Demoncy or Demoncy. Those were huge for especially the very first EP, but then even for the first album. And then I absolutely love those bands. I listen to them all the time. But as I went on to the new album, I just for whatever reason that became such a background influence, and maybe it's because I felt like I had done as much as I could do with it. Um, but they were hardly on the radar of what I was listening to or thinking about around the time that I was writing Pestilential Hymns. I was spending a lot more time with oh shoot, I'm trying to think a lot more time, like I said, with Sinister or something like Sacramentum or maybe even Knit in Division 187. I was listening to them a lot. And I know it probably doesn't sound anything like that, but at least the sense of melodicism that pops up every now and then.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can definitely hear that. Yeah. So, what do you think? What's the next step for you? Are you going to be playing this album live, or are you on the next album? What's going to happen?
So, future's kind of up in the air right now, in the sense of, so we don't have a drummer, and I've always figured that the only way we're playing live is with the drummer, obviously. And our location, smack dab in the center of Kansas. There is just not many drummers here. The only ones I know that are pretty good. They growing up, they played in a bunch of like deathcore bands. I don't even know if any of them play anymore. And there's some guys semi close by in some brutal death bands, but they're a little bit too busy to be making a long drive to practice with us. So I don't know if there's much of a possibility of live playing for us, at least at this point in our lives. We may later. Like I said, family wise, two of us have little kids, and so they're a handful, and they'll probably have to wait till they get a little bit older before we can make time to do that kind of stuff. But in terms of writing new music, even that is a little bit on the hold for the moment, but it's not off limits. I will certainly be doing some writing. I will certainly put out something with Thaumaturgy again. May not be as quickly as I did the first three releases, though. I've talked it over with Tyler a little bit, and the next thing we'll probably do is an EP, maybe 3 to 4 songs, and it'll be slow going, maybe a couple years before we get there.
Um, I mean, is that because you feel satisfied with the way, the evolution, and you feel like you've expressed all that you needed to express for now, or
Not entirely. It's unfortunately it's a time thing at the moment. We don't feel as if we have enough time to do it. It was part of that was with Pestilential Hymns was we had that deadline with Memento Mori, which we agreed to. It's not Memento Mori's fault, but it made it kind of hard to get that finished in time, and so kind of soured us on the music writing front. But in the future, I just plan on absolutely putting no deadline on it so I can spend a little bit more time, because I honestly do feel like Pestilential Hymns, I like it a lot, but it suffers from being a little bit rushed, at least in my opinion. There's a lot more things I could have done with it, and I especially could have polished up the guitar sound, the drums, all that stuff, but just didn't feel like I had the time. And so with this next one, as we go on to write more music, I'm definitely going to take it slower. So it may be a little bit, but I think it will be an improvement whenever we do. I'd be really interested in including a live drummer, even if I have to reach out to, some friends we have in other bands that live far away. Because I know some people will do that. They'll collaborate and, do all their stuff over the internet. I've never tried it, so I don't know how hard that is. But um, and then in the future, we will certainly be sticking with the style on Pestilential Hymns, but probably taking it a little bit further. I started writing one song in particular, and yeah, I just plan on making it. It's going to be a little bit more weird, or a good amount more weird. There's going to be a lot more variation in it. Um, I find myself, and it'll be considerably more death metal, at least if you could think maybe in the sense of like Dark Throne, Soulside Journey, kind of odd, kind of out there, but a little bit more in that dark metal realm. But I'm sure I'll still include some of the more war metal or USBM influences that I can't seem to get rid of.
I mean, that's a really, really funny one. Soulside Journey. It's an album that I've seen a lot of people praise, well, sort of started praising in the last, 5, 6 years mainly. Um, but it's one that it feels like it's impossible to replicate. It feels like it's impossible to emulate. I've never seen anyone really like fully give it a try because it's not like technical at all. Most of it's relatively simple, but it just feels like you never know where the notes are gonna land on that album.
It is so odd. Yeah, that's what I like about it, is that it's just such a strange, unique experience that you're only going to get with that album. And it has the weird style, and I've noticed this where they'll play one riff for a relatively short amount of time, and then every time the drums cut out, the guitar introduces the new riff, drums come back, and it's an entirely different direction than you expected anything to go, which makes it sound like it's going to be disjointed, but it's not. It is a cool, unified experience that you just can't get with anything else. And so the way when I reference it for my writing, it'll be more of having having the courage to let the song uh, break up a little bit and be a little more strange and varied than I have so far. Because I'll have this tendency to want to keep it the parts similar enough that the album doesn't fall apart. But I've done that enough times, so might as well be a little bit adventurous with it.
Hmm. Definitely. So I think, one thing you said that is really interesting, because I've seen, amp sims are getting bigger and bigger. More and more bands are using them. I mean, I know in the modern metal deathcore world, they've been using them since what, like late 2000s. How how do you feel that you have to approach them and you have to mix them and work with them? Do you feel like it's just plug and play into your guitar and then you mix it like any other distortion, or do you feel like there's something else going on there?
The thing I notice with it is it takes, and this may be personal preference. I'm sure in our area of music, most people would agree here, but the organic, natural sound of an amp is like a live amp is just so much better. That along with obviously with real drums, getting that organic sound is just, I mean, it's essential. And the amp sims to me were in this situation were kind of a necessary evil. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but it was a technical limitation at the time. And so something I've noticed with them as you use them is they are just extremely dry and trying to think of a good way to put it. They have no sense of presence to them. They're very flat. And so then you have to do a bunch of extra work on the back end to try and hide that to where it gets rid of that digital production sound. Because I don't know how you feel about it on Pestilential Hymns, but I can still hear that it has a lot of that digital sound to it. It doesn't sound very organic to me, which is, I think, in my opinion, being critical of myself is one of the failings of the album. Is I'd much rather have um, a powerful, organic sounding guitar, but instead I had to, you have to go in and slap a bunch of effects on it to make it sound real. Unfortunately, at least the ones that I had, I worked with some decent ones that were pretty low cost. You can spend a bunch of money on that stuff too, and I'm sure it sounds better.
Yeah, what did you use? The DSP, which is really popular, or
What did
Amplitude,
I
or
use? Um, I'm trying to remember what it was. Initially used Emissary, I think is what it was, um, by STL Tones, I think. And so I recorded all of it with that, but then thought it sounded too thin. So I went back in and I purchased one from them because that Emissary is free. So I went back in and I purchased one so I could get a little higher quality. And I wish I could tell you, I wish I could remember what it was off the top of my head, but it was decent, considerably better, a lot more powerful than the one I had initially. Um, but even then, going back, I just it sounds a little bit weak and thin, um, which I wish I could have avoided that one.
yeah, definitely. But then again, I know for a fact that from what I've heard, a lot of modern metal producers they like very small, thin, very precise sounds so that they can expand them, because it's the only way you can get that kind of very brick walled sound, right? You can't do it with a big amp.
That makes sense, yeah, because that big amp is going to take up so much space in your soundscape that if you can get it to where you have a lot more control over it, if it's a very little narrow band of sound, and you can fit a lot more in there.
Yeah. So Memento Mori, that's quite a funny one because I'm not sure if they're very popular in America, but here, especially where I'm in France, they're very big. I, not quite as not quite as the bigger labels, but still very big. I mean, how did that feel working with them as a very underground artist?
It was surprisingly simple and straightforward. I think the guy's name was Raul that I worked with, and he was super relaxed and understanding of me being, the one man guy with some pretty low cost equipment. He tolerated that pretty well because first when he hit me up to do the album, um, I showed him some of this newer material because he had only heard the first two. I didn't send this new stuff to him, and he was a little bit hesitant when he heard the newer stuff. but stuck with me through it and trusted the process, and it worked out pretty well. But he was very easy to work with. Low demand, just set that the initial deadline, and then from there I communicated with him as I was making progress. And very, yeah, like I said, very easy to work with. I would send him updates every now and then. Only once or twice did I send him something, and he's like, "Hey, that's the music sounds good. You're going to need to do something about the recording quality, though." So that was interesting. So that was actually when I went in and I got that other amp sim, because I thought, oh well, this just sounds terribly thin, and so maybe maybe I can get away with buying one and beefing it up a lot, and nobody will notice.
All right, perfect. Any final words?
Um, no, just thanks for reaching out. I'm glad that, honestly, this album, it was difficult to make, but it was fun, and that I got to uh, be a little less tense about it, and enjoy the process of including, like I said, my other influences that weren't coming out on the earlier things. And I didn't expect many people to like it, and so the fact that anybody that any reviewer that I have any respect for their opinions, like yourself or Hate Meditations or deathmetal.org. That's stuff that I've read a lot. And the fact that it seems to be well received among you guys, and maybe a little less of what I would call, I don't want to alienate anybody here, but I would call like still underground, but slightly more normie type, the guys that may be listening to my earlier stuff and blood and incantation or something like that.
Yeah.
They don't seem to, it doesn't seem to be as well received in that crowd, but I expected that. So it's been pretty neat that it's popped up, like I said, with the reviewers that I actually pay attention to. I've been following your label for a long time. You've been a fan of like Into Oblivion and shoot, what's their name? Mephitis or Mephitis, however it's said. I've always been big fans of both of those guys. So it was cool to hear that you liked this one.
Yeah, much appreciated. Thanks. Okay, well, thank you very much, Katie. Have a good
Yep,
evening.
you have a good day.
See